Hello and welcome to our sixth lecture for the story of Christianity. Last time we looked at the emergence of the Reformation in both Germany and Switzerland, especially at the life of Luther, and how the Reformation developed its two strands of the Lutheran Church and the Reformed Church. Today we're going to be looking at the spread of the Reformation ideas to England and the implications that that has for later Reformed theology, as well as how the Catholic Church itself reformed and reacted to the Reform movements of its day. We'll begin by looking at the English Reformation, its beginnings under the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI. Then we'll be looking at the struggle over religion in the reign of Mary and Elizabeth I. And then we're going to move a little beyond the Reformation period into the 17th century and look at the fate of English Protestantism under the Stuarts leading up to the English Civil War and the ultimate restoration of the monarchy there. The second half of the lecture will be looking at what is known as the Catholic Reformation. We'll see how the Catholic Church responded to these movements and how it attempted to get its own house in order at the Council of Trent. We'll also be looking at some of the emergences of new religious movements, religious orders in the Catholic Church, especially that of the Jesuits, and looking at their ideas and how they began to spread the gospel to the East. We'll have a brief moment to discuss the coming of Christianity to Japan to set that into context. So let's begin with the character of the English Reformation. As we go through this story, we'll notice a couple things. First, the actors in the English Reformation are much more monarchs than they are reformers. So as we told the story of Luther's Reformation, it was very much about Luther and his ideas and his activities. Similarly with Zwingli and Calvin. And this is largely due to the different kind of movements of reform that we see here. In the Continental Reform, Luther and Zwingli especially, were working in places where there are not very powerful monarchs. Luther living in the Holy Roman Empire, it's much more important what the local prince thinks than what the emperor thinks himself. There's a much more give and take without a strong monarchy. In Switzerland, we're dealing with towns that have been self-governed for nearly a century themselves. So the decision-making was much more local, and a large personality could dictate that from below. However, as we turn to the English Reformation, we see that this is primarily dictated by monarchs. This is partially because England is a much more centralized country with a much stronger monarchy, and this has been the case throughout most of the Middle Ages. This has led many scholars to question whether or not the Reformation coming to England was really a reform of the people or if it was imposed from above. We will not be able to settle that question today, but it is a much more complicated question. England is the only country in which the Reformation is fully absorbed into an existing state. We see similar things going on in Scandinavia, but they're more at the fringe of European politics. The only major state to adopt Protestant ideas is England, and this comes about because of the decisions of its monarchs, and specifically some of the issues surrounding Henry VIII and his marriage and the potential heirs for it. And so that's not to say that the common people were not excited about the Reformation or did not jump on board. However, it was much more mixed. Most of the Reformations on the continent happened through popular kind of buying into the Reformation and coming to believe these things themselves. That happened in some parts of England, but it was a much slower process. We'll notice that the English Reformation stretches over a much longer period of time than either the initial movements of Luther or Zwingli. And what results out of this is the Church of England, which is sometimes called a via media, or a middle way between Catholicism and Protestantism. And this is pushed back all the way to the time of Elizabeth and even maybe Henry VIII. I would posit that this is not exactly the case in this period. The English Church of the late 16th, early 17th century fits very comfortably within the realm of international Calvinist churches, sitting alongside that of Scotland, the Netherlands, Switzerland, etc. However, it does not go to the same lengths of reform, especially around the liturgy and church structure as these other traditions will. And that leads to a kind of half-finished Reformation, at least on the part of some people within the church. It's out of this impulse that we see the burgeoning Puritan movement. This idea of the Church of England as a via media comes much later in some ways. In the 19th century reform movement within Anglicanism known as the Oxford movement. So I'm going to be telling a story that's much more England within the broader context of the Continental Reformation and not something unique unto itself. But the English Reformation must be taken on its own terms, and we must see the unique causes, the unique characters, and the unique structures that led to the English Reform taking the path it did. And this must begin with the towering figure of Henry VIII. Henry VIII was the second king of the Tudor dynasty. This dynasty had come out on top of a quite tumultuous period in English history known as the War of the Roses, and one of the main concerns of the Tudor monarchy was securing the right to the throne, having a secure succession in place, and keeping their local barons in line. This was Henry's main goal in many of his actions. And for this reason, and his own personal commitment to the Catholic faith, Henry initially opposes the Protestant movement, even writing a work against Luther, most likely ghostwritten, in 1521 entitled The Assertion of the Seven Sacraments. If you recall, Luther had rejected all seven and proposed two sacraments, the Lord's Supper and baptism, with maybe confession as a third. For this work, Henry is actually awarded the title Defender of the Faith by Leo X. However, things are going to change quite rapidly because of issues with the succession and Henry's personal life. And this is what has come to be called the King's Great Matter, a euphemism for the issues surrounding Henry's divorce to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. So Catherine of Aragon was actually married originally to Arthur's older brother, Arthur. And he died quite quickly into their marriage, and because this was securing an alliance with Spain, or at least a detente between these two powers, Henry VII proposed that Henry VIII marry Catherine as his brother did. This was actually not allowed according to current traditions of the church because one could not marry your brother's wife. This was too close in relation, and therefore Henry had to get a special dispensation from the papacy to even marry Catherine to begin with. However, after many years of marriage, Catherine is unable to produce a male heir. She does give birth to a daughter, Mary, who we'll come back to again in this story. Because of this failure to produce an heir, and Henry is quite a bit younger than Catherine, he begins to propose a divorce from his wife so he can marry again and have an heir. However, to do this, he has to appeal to the Pope. And the Pope at the time refuses to grant an annulment to the marriage. Now, this is rather complicated because Catherine of Aragon's nephew is Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who has recently defeated the Pope and it basically has him under his thumb. And so he does not want to see his aunt disgraced by a divorce and pressures the Pope to refuse to give an annulment to Henry's marriage. This will lead to a long series of events that are focused around Henry's love life, and in this, the entire balance of the English Church will be met. This comes to a head in 1534 with the Act of Supremacy. In this, Henry has the Parliament declare that he is the head of the Church. Therefore, this is a movement away from the supremacy of the papacy in Rome. This outlaws all attempts to appeal royal decisions outside of the kingdom. And because he is now head of the church, and he's got his theologians working on this, Henry divorces Catherine and marries a young lady in waiting named Anne Boleyn. Now, this goes into a rather complex story of Henry's 6 wives. They're fairly difficult to keep straight in some ways, but the rhyme is always helpful. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Anne Boleyn also suffers the same fate as Catherine of Aragon, unable to bear a male heir, and she is ultimately beheaded, most likely for spurious charges of adultery. Henry's next wife is Jane Seymour, who bears him his only son, Edward, who will become Edward VI, and she dies as a result of the birth of Edward. Henry's next wife is Anne of Cleves, and this is a much more short-lived engagement and doesn't actually end up being an official marriage in the eyes of the church. Anne of Cleves is the sister of one of the princes in the Holy Roman Empire who is Protestant, and Henry, because he's broken with Rome, is looking to make allies against those forces that might oppose him. One of Henry's counselors, who's very important in this whole story, is a man named Thomas Cromwell, who basically gets this marriage off the ground, and Henry agrees to marry her sight unseen, except for a portrait. Legend goes that the actual Anne of Cleves did not live up to her portrait, and neither Henry nor herself really wanted to go forward with the marriage. It's probably more complicated than that, as Henry found the alliance with the prince in the Holy Roman Empire no longer to his advantage. But they divorced quite quickly. The marriage is never consummated, and Anne of Cleves seems to be quite happy with this occasion. His following wife, Catherine Howard, is beheaded, this time for proven adultery. Why someone would cheat on a man such as Henry VIII with his proclivities for taking it all the way is beyond me. And finally, his final wife is Catherine Parr, who does survive him. All of these wives are rather complicated, but in this, Henry is trying to secure the succession by any means necessary. And so, his break with Rome is primarily a political one. The Act of Supremacy, it should be stressed, is not an introduction of Protestantism into England. All Henry is really doing here is replacing the Pope with himself, the king, as the head of the church. The fact that this is not an introduction of Protestantism can be seen by an act of 1539 called the Six Articles. This reaffirms Catholic dogmas such as transubstantiation, clerical celibacy, the confession to priests, and private masses, all of which were rejected by the Continental Reformers. And it imposes a penalty that to deny any of these articles is heresy, and therefore will result in being burnt at the stake. So Henry is not really trying to bring Reformation to England. He's easing up slightly on the reins of part of the church that once reformed, and he's just breaking ties with Rome, but he will stay pretty much firm in his Catholic convictions until his death. However, he is much more concerned with royal power than he is with the religious affairs. He will burn at the stake both Catholic sympathizers and Protestant sympathizers at the same time. However, this does produce a very strong reaction from forces outside of England, and in 1538 the Pope excommunicates Henry and even calls for a crusade from Francis I of France and Charles V to take back England for the Reformation. This does not take place in Henry's day, but the threat of international Catholicism coming back to England will be felt throughout these periods. Henry does push the reform beyond just kind of paper reform in the church. He does dissolve the monasteries, but this is partially for his own gain. He confiscates their lands and sells it back to his barons, in some ways solidifying his position, and making the barons and the nobility complicit in this rejection of Roman Catholicism. One of the reasons that many of these landed nobles don't want to move back into the Catholic Church is that they know that if they do, they'll have to give up the lands that they had bought from the religious orders. So, at the death of Henry in 1547, the English Church is not very reformed at all. It is broken away from the papacy, but there are forces within the kingdom that want to see it go much further and embrace the full Protestant tradition as they've seen on the continent. And with Henry's death, there is the opportunity for this to take place under the reign of Edward VI, Henry's only living male heir. He becomes king at 9 years of age, and he reigns for only 6 years. However, during this period, the Protestant faith takes root and flourishes within England, especially through the counselors of Edward, such as Edward Seymour, his uncle, and Thomas Cranmer, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who promote not just Protestantism, but a very reformed theology of this. And in some ways, Edward is seen by his contemporaries as a new Josiah, coming forth to bring reform of religion throughout the land. And so we're going to look at one of the main contributors to this Reformation, the architect of the English Reform, and that is Thomas Cranmer, who, taking the initiative under the regency of Edward VI, produces much of the reform within England, and that is Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer was Archbishop of Canterbury even under Henry VIII, and he did help build a case in favor of Henry's annulment to Catherine of Aragon. This event was rather complicated, especially because, according to current canon law, one couldn't marry one's your dead brother's wife was not allowed at the time, and this was supported from texts from Leviticus that prohibited such a practice. And one of the curses that's pronounced in Leviticus on this is they will not bear a male heir. And so Henry might have genuinely thought that he was under judgment by God for marrying his brother's wife. And Thomas helped him in this cause. Cranmer produced some of the evidence that was supposed to support the annulment of this marriage. However, Cranmer also had secret sympathies with Protestantism. These came about as he traveled to Germany in the service of Henry VIII, and there he actually secretly married the sister of a Lutheran reformer named Osiander, and he began to be committed to Protestant positions. He doesn't enact these when he comes back right away, but he will become the architect of reform under Edward VI. And this is primarily through his book, The Common Book of Prayer, first edition in 1529, and an updated edition that is even more away from the Catholic tradition in 1552. The Book of Common Prayer will be the set liturgy for the Church of England even to this day, although it's been updated at several points throughout that, and it introduces a Protestant liturgy to England. It removes references to ideas such as transubstantiation, it removes prayers to the saints and the 1552 edition, and it gives a much more Protestant flavor. In this, it is very interesting to see how this reform comes about in England, not so much through ecclesiastical treatises or doctrinal work, but through the reform of liturgy primarily. It is from the Book of Common Prayer that most people in England will come to embrace the Protestant faith, because it's embedding the theology of salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, within the words that one speaks every week. Another element of this that brings the English church into greater conformity with the contemporary Reformed tradition is that Cranmer invites Peter Martyr Vermigli and Martin Butzer to come teach at the leading universities in England, Oxford and Cambridge, respectively. These two men were influential reformers in their own right, Butzer being the reformer of Strasbourg, and being a first-generation reformer engaging with both Luther and Zwingli. He would take up the post at Cambridge and begin to teach his theology of the nature of the church and the nature of justification by faith. Peter Martyr Vermigli is another very interesting figure. He was initially an Italian who was the head of a monastery there. He comes into contact with the writings of Zwingli especially, and converts away from the Roman Catholic faith and travels to Strasbourg and then to Zurich. He's invited to Oxford, and there he engages in disputations over the nature of the Eucharist. These two figures will help shape many of the later leaders of the English Reformation in their teaching at both Oxford and Cambridge. Butzer will die in his position, while Vermigli is forced to return back to the continent after Edward VI dies and Mary I comes to reign in England. So, Edward VI does not last very long. He was always a rather sickly young man, and upon his death, the succession reverts to Henry's first daughter, which is Mary I, who was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She had spent most of her time exiled from England in some sense with her relatives in Spain, and when she becomes Queen of England, she actually marries Philip II of Spain, Charles V's son, who is the King of Spain and has a stake in the Holy Roman Empire as well. And Mary comes back and reestablishes Catholicism. In this act, many Protestants were martyred, including Cranmer, and such figures as Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer, who were both reforming bishops under Edward VI. This was a very rough time for Protestantism, and for this reason, Mary I is often called Bloody Mary for the acts of persecution, numbering roughly 300. Many of these martyrdoms would be memorialized in the work Fox's Book of Martyrs, which would definitively shape the consciousness of English Protestantism, recalling the martyrdom under the Catholic Church. And in this, there's many famous scenes, one of which is Latimer and Ridley being tied together and awaiting to be burned. And Latimer turns to Ridley and said, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." Very stirring stuff. Cranmer does not hold up as well under these threats of persecution. He actually recants his commitment to the Protestant faith. However, as he's being taken to the pyre to be burnt, which was the standard death sentence for heretics of the time, he recants his recantation and fully confesses the faith of salvation by faith alone, by the grace of God. And as the fire is burned, he takes his right hand, as you can see above in this image, and thrusts it into the fire first, since it had betrayed him, as he wrote his recantation. The Marian persecutions did not last that long, with their reign only being 5 years, and in some ways, in the long run, they probably did more to promote Protestantism than to deter it. Because one of the outcomes of this persecution was that many Protestants who did not stay fled to the continent. This helped to solidify ties between the continental Reformed tradition and the English Church. Many of these refugees would travel to Geneva and to Zurich, and there they would learn much more about the Reformed tradition. At this point, the option of a Lutheran England seems very remote, with most of the influence coming from the Swiss Reformed and parts of the Dutch Reformed tradition that are developing at this time. One of those men who traveled to the continent and ended up in Geneva was John Knox, who at the time was serving in England as a local court preacher. Knox is an extremely interesting and coarse figure in some ways. He was at different times a mercenary, a galley slave, a bodyguard, and a rebel leader, and he also became a preacher. Knox went to Geneva, and there, as we saw in the last time, he saw what he thought was the model of Christian society. And he very much imbibed Calvin's doctrine and sought to go back to Scotland to promote it. He would later return to Scotland and help bring about the Presbyterian Church there, influenced by what he saw in Calvin's Geneva and the structure of the French Reformed Church that is developing at this time. The Parliament of Scotland will officially promote Presbyterianism in 1560, and Knox will be one of the main organizers of that and preachers of the movement. Knox was not always the most prudent or wise figure. Near the end of his time in Geneva, he wrote a rather infamous work called A Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. By this, he was directing it at 3 Catholic queens who happened to be named Mary. Mary, Queen of Scots, Mary of England, and Mary of Ghent, who was currently in power in France. However, it was one of the most ill-timed printing occasions of all history, because as it's going to the press, who comes to the throne at Mary's death but Elizabeth I, who will forever dislike Knox, and he never goes back to serve much in England. With the death of Mary and some of her key counselors on the same day, especially a man named Reginald Pole, who was one vote away from being the Pope and was a reformer within the Catholic Church, Elizabeth ascends to the throne. And in this, we see another shift in the Reformation. She restores Protestantism, but does not have quite the zeal as Edward VI counselors did to bring about the full Reformed tradition. What happens under Elizabeth is generally called the Elizabethan settlement. She reinstitutes an act of uniformity that unifies all church practice under the Book of Common Prayer, which is rewritten again in 1559, and she issues the 39 Articles, which are a revision of an earlier work by Thomas Cranmer. These articles are a little more vague, with a bit of room to work. They distance themselves completely from Catholicism, rejecting transubstantiation, rejecting the Mass, and rejecting the combination of faith and works. They seem to promote either a Calvinist or a Zwinglian interpretation of the Lord's Supper, and they reject such doctrines as purgatory. However, in some ways, by the use of the Book of Common Prayer and the 39 Articles, several people in the Church feel like the Reform has not gone far enough. In some ways, the Reformed Church, the Church of England at this period, is a Reformed Church, which would be recognized very clearly by the Continental Reformed. Yet, it is not yet fully Reformed in terms of worship and church polity. And many figures within the Church of England will long to bring about what they see as the completion of the Reformation in these two parts. Under Elizabeth, tensions still remained, especially over the debate of a fixed liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer, Many reformers thought this was not appropriate and too closely resembled the Roman Mass, and they wanted a simpler liturgy that did not have the set prayers, etc., of the Book of Common Prayer. There were questions over vestments of what should the priest wear during worship. Much of the Church of England still wore surplices, which were around the neck, that were special kind of ceremonial garb for the pastor during the worship service. Many people who would later become known as Puritans would reject such a practice, finding no evidence for it in the scripture and seeing it too close to papal religion. Another area of continued tension was the structure of the church, especially the question of bishops. Many reformers from the continent saw no real support for bishops within the New Testament and therefore opted for a Presbyterian government, which was the rule by local elders who gathered together in what are known as presbyteries. However, the English church would retain the system of archbishops and bishops and priests below that. Another debate existed over the prominence of preaching, which in the Book of Common Prayer can kind of seem to be put at a lower status than the celebration of the Eucharist. And it sometimes Elizabeth would discourage preaching as long as one might for fear of causing dissent on religious questions, while others in the church would want to give a much higher place to preaching. All of these would be debates throughout Elizabeth's quite long reign, with the Elizabethan settlement holding quite firm, keeping a more or less Reformed theology with a more Catholic-looking element of liturgy and practice. One thing we must take into account in Elizabeth's reign, if we're going to understand the history of England, and especially the church history there, is the English fear of international Calvinism. This was not an idle fear, but something that they very much had to worry about. Just as Henry VIII had been excommunicated, Elizabeth is excommunicated in 1570. And the Pope absolves all of her Catholic subjects of their loyalty to Elizabeth. This harkens back all the way to what we saw with the investiture controversy and Gregory VII's excommunication of Henry IV. In this, the Pope is actually putting many of Elizabeth's Catholic subjects in a horrible position. They are now seen as very likely potential traitors, and Elizabeth will persecute many Catholics in this, especially priests coming into the country. But it should be noted that this is seen slightly different by Elizabeth. She does not burn these men, but has them beheaded, signifying that she sees this not as a religious activity, but as a treasonable activity, because these are people in the realm that are committed to the overthrow of her government. And she's not being paranoid. There are plots against her life, most famously the Rodolfo plot of 1571, which is an international attempt to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary Queen of Scots on the English throne that was carried out by an Italian Catholic merchant. So Elizabeth and the English people feared the forcible reinstitution of Catholicism into England, especially after the horrors of Mary's reign. These fears came to a head, especially in 1588, with the sending of the Spanish Armada. However, this was defeated, especially by the forces of Sir Francis Drake, and this was seen as divine blessing on the nation and protection from the encroachments of forces that would seek to overthrow the Protestantism. This was an invasion force coming from Spain that was led by the Duke of Parma, who had recently been putting down Protestant revolts in the Netherlands. And this gives the opportunity for one of Elizabeth's most famous speeches, in which he says, "I know I have the body of but a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm." Elizabeth was seen as a great monarch in her country. Elizabeth never took a husband, but in some ways was married to her country. In some ways, this was seen as an act of the Virgin Queen committing herself to the country. And she was extremely capable and a very strong leader. Above, as she's giving this speech, she is said to have put on a piece of armor over a lace dress to address the troops. That above is not Elizabeth, but Helen Marian, but I think it works. Okay. Because Elizabeth does not ever marry, she does not have an heir. So upon her death in 1603, the crown actually passes into Scotland. And at this time, the King of Scotland is James IV, who will become James I of England. And this ushers in a new dynasty in England known as the Stuarts. And this was an okay situation for the English Protestants because Scotland had been reformed itself. James IV of Scotland is actually raised as a Presbyterian, and many of those in the Church of England who want deeper reform are hoping that he will actually bring a Presbyterian form of government into England. However, when he comes, he upholds the Elizabethan settlement and with a commitment to the Reformed faith, but still rejecting the reform of church structure. This is partially because James believed very strongly in the divine right of kings. And in his mind, to remove the bishop was to remove the king himself. So to have a structure in the church that did not reflect the hierarchical structure of the kingdom would just give people ideas to want to remove the king himself. And this is in some ways a foreshadowing of what will become. James does engage in some religious reform. He issues another Book of Common Prayer in 1604. He also allows for the translation of the Bible, the famous King James Version of 1611. And he even puts out a book called the Book of Sport in 1618, which is recommending certain sports to be played and what's allowed on the Sabbath. So he was a rather controversial figure amongst many in the church who would seek greater reform. It's during this period under James that we see the emergence of what will later be called the Puritan and the Laudian parties. These are two opposing factions within the Church of England, one pushing for greater reform and one moving in a direction of hierarchy and sacramentalism. So let's briefly look at these two parties. The first you might be familiar with, and that is the Puritan party. Now, it is typical in scholarship to discuss the difficulty of defining the term Puritan. This was not a term they took to themselves, but was a scornful name by their opponents, that they wanted to, that they were holier than thou, basically, that they wanted a more firm commitment to things that others rejected. And these movements are coming about even under the realm of Elizabeth, those who reject vestments, those who want to see a Presbyterian style of government. Many figures emerge in this early period. One of the most contentious is a man named Thomas Cartwright, who served through the latter part of Elizabeth's reign. He especially inveighed against vestments and was quite opposed to that and wanted to see more discipline in the church. But this emerging Puritan party wanted to see a thorough reform of the liturgy and remove those things that might lead too closely to the Roman practice. They wanted to remove the strict structure of the Book of Common Prayer. They wanted to remove fanciful elements that they saw in the liturgy and to move further into conformity with the Continental Reformed Church with its simplicity, removal of images, etc. They also wanted a reform of church structure. They wanted the end to the bishops and the implementation of a Presbyterian government. And many of them wanted a stricter observation of the Sabbath. This was particularly an issue after James I's issuing of the Book of Sport, which angered many Puritans greatly. So, on the other hand, we have the Laudian party. And this is actually an anachronistic term. Laud will come into the picture later, but many have named this party even under James I as the Laudians. They might also be called Arminians, or some have named them early Anglicans, those who would pursue this more via media position. Arminianism is a term for a movement going on in the Netherlands at the beginning of the 17th century that pushed back against Calvinist doctrines of predestination and the inability of humanity to choose God. The famous TULIP acronym comes as the points from that, not the actual acronym, come from the rejection of the Arminian position that was known as the Synod of Dort. Some of these ideas are filtering into England here. The ideas that the human will can choose God, that election is not unconditional but is based on foreseen faith, that that grace is ultimately resistible, that God can act but humans can choose not to move there, that Christ's atonement is universal and open to all, and that once one has come to faith, one can still fall away. These positions of Arminianism were rejected by the Synod of Dort, which was an international synod of Reformed churches throughout Europe. However, these ideas do begin to filter into England, especially in the reign of Charles I, who comes after James. But in this early period, there is an emerging party that makes sense to call Laudian, and it has its beginnings in such figures as Richard Hooker, as well as later Lancelot Andrewes, who carried forward these ideas. Their main themes are set against the Puritan party. They promote much more the ceremonial act of worship and promote the sacraments over preaching. So in this, it is very much that the Lord's Supper is set above the office of preaching. There's generally a higher view of clerical office and the episcopacy, or the nature of bishops. And this is seen as not merely a pragmatic element, but is jure divino. That is, it is God mandated that there be bishops. And on contraposing that was a view of de jure divino Presbyterianism, that this was a mandate of God that there not be bishops. This was a quite contentious fight. It's even in this early period that the pastors become known as priests once again, a term that was much rejected in the early Protestant movement as being too close to the Roman Catholic position. One of the elements of this Laudian party, especially as it developed, was the weakening of the Reformed Orthodox position on predestination, grace, and assurance, as I've said, moving much more in an Arminian position, which, to bring it back to some of the things we've discussed before, is at best a semi-Augustinian position, and some of its worst forms are moving into almost a semi-Pelagian position. As these parties grew in strength at the end of James' reign, it was pretty clear that the Laudian party was on top, as Lancelot Andrewes himself, one of the proponents of these beliefs, was tasked to find the tutor for his son, young Charles I. And it is under Charles I that many of these tensions will explode, eventually leading to civil war. Charles I was a strong believer in the divine right of kings, and he reigned as such. While his father could say that without bishops there is no king, Charles was much more firm in this position and saw his need to rule without the real buy-in of his subjects, especially Parliament. He'll have a very strained relation with the English Parliament. And he'll also bring tensions with those conservative parties in the English Church when he marries a French Catholic. If we've been paying attention so far, you'll know why that was a fear. The English deeply feared a heir to the throne who was Catholic, who would reimpose Catholicism and bring all these kind of plots to their new level. They have seen their monarchs almost killed. This happened again in 1605 with the Gunpowder Plot, as Guy Fawkes and other Catholic conspirators attempted to blow up the Houses of Parliament. They've avoided this with rebutting the Spanish Armada, and this opposition to international Catholicism is very deeply rooted in the English psyche at this time. And so by Charles I marrying a Catholic, and even a Catholic of France, there's much worry around England that this might foretell a reinstitution of Catholicism to the land. So in this, Charles begins to have many conflicts with Parliament over both political power and religious matters. He very much pursued a high church policy, which led to great distrust amongst the Puritans, and especially with his ties to William Laud, who would become the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633. It is Laud who we name after this Laudian party, although it stretches back prior to his main level. He very strongly favored sacramentalism, that is, a focus on the sacraments over preaching and personal piety, and he actively promoted Arminianism within the church, which continued to breed conflict with the Puritan party. One of the symbols of this for many of the Puritans was his reintroduction of the communion rail and kneeling at the Lord's Supper. This had been an issue at the very earliest period, even under Edward VI. The act of kneeling at communion was seen by many reformers to be undue honor to the bread and the wine. This is especially because in Roman Catholic practice in the Middle Ages and up till this day, there is a practice of adoring the host. Remember, if the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Christ, an act of worship towards them is not seen as idolatrous to the Catholics, but is seen as an actual worship of Christ. While the Reformers saw such bowing down and worshiping before these elements as an act of idolatry. So even while Laud did not approve of that, and neither did earlier figures within the English Church, many Puritans and other Reformed rejected this practice as far too close to the superstitious practice of earlier Catholic worship, and maybe tempting the laity to idolatry itself. In these rather heavy-handed ecclesiastical policies, James makes a fairly bad move. In 1638, he attempts to impose a form of the Book of Common Prayer on the Church of Scotland. And this is not a good idea, to try to impose religious reform on the Scottish Church. That does not go over well. We'll see its outcome in a second. He also requires, so this is Laud at this point, requires that all ministers within the Church of England take the following oath, which has generally come down to us as the etc. oath of 1640. It says that, nor will I ever give my consent to alter the government of this church by archbishops, bishops, deacons, archdeacons, etc., as it stands now established, and as by right it ought to stand. So this is basically an oath that Puritans within the church cannot take. Not only do they oppose the act of archbishops, bishops, deans, etc., but the use of the term etc. opens it up to all sorts of things, that new institutions can be made in the church, that there can be returning to practices of the Roman Catholic Church, is the fear here. And so the religious policy under James I causes great tensions with the Puritans, especially because of Laud's practices, and this will eventually lead to war. This begins with what is known as the First Bishops' War. As a result of trying to impose Laud's prayer book on the Scottish Church, many of the Puritans rebel and fight against the English. Charles goes to engage with them, and he is actually defeated. Therefore, he needs to call a parliament. He needs to continue this war against the Scots, but he does not have any money of his own to raise an army. Therefore, he has to call a parliament. Charles has been refusing to call a parliament for roughly 10 years because he does not want them to enact any legislation that would go against his kingly power. And in fact, in many ways, because he sees the divine right of kings to rule, he is annoyed at parliaments themselves with this idea of the representation of the people, or at least the nobility, to the crown. However, one of the things that the Parliament has complete control over, and this is coming from the Middle Ages itself, is the right to issue new taxes. So in order to get the money to raise an army, Charles is forced to call a parliament. And this is what is known as the Long Parliament, because it refuses to be disbanded when Charles I sets it to be so. So in order to raise these funds, he calls it back, and the Long Parliament takes advantage of the weak position of the king to push for both political and ecclesiastical reform. It's quite a long story, and I can't get into all of it today, but this conflict between Charles I and the Long Parliament will lead to what is generally called the First English Civil War, which will have many ramifications throughout the time. I do not have enough time to go into all of this, but the English Civil War was a very complex affair that has many stages, and it pits parliamentary forces against royalist forces, sometimes known as Cavaliers and Roundheads, the Cavaliers being the supporters of the Royalists and the Roundheads being the supporters of the Parliament. The Scottish quickly get drawn into the war, initially on the side of Parliament, but eventually siding again with the Royalists. Irish forces get involved on the side of the king as well. And there are generally shifting tides and fortunes throughout the war. However, eventually, the Parliament will gain ascendancy. And at this point, because of certain radical forces within the army especially, Charles will be executed as a traitor to England. And the English Civil War has many great stories. It is a very interesting period. And it's been debated how this should be understood historically. Is the English Civil War the first revolution for liberty? Should it be seen in some sort of continuity with the American Revolution and with the French Revolution? Is this the exercise of political freedom against tyrannical royal rule? Or, as others have said, is this the last war of religion, which had raged throughout the continent at various periods from the mid-16th century up till the mid-17th? Was this a war over politics or religion? And I would like to say it's in some ways both. The politics and the religion in the English church could not be fully separated. Both sides were thinking that they were fulfilling the will of God and the right exercise of religion in England at the time. But there are also many political situations, and these religious lines can be blurred between different supporters. For our purposes in church history, there is an event that occurs during the Civil War that we must take account of, and that is the Westminster Assembly. With the advent of civil war, Parliament wants to enact religious reform, much more along the lines of the Puritan party. And therefore, they call an assembly at Westminster to do just that. It initially convenes in the summer of 1643 and will do most of its work over the next 5 years, although it isn't officially dissolved for many years. The initial task of the assembly is to redraft the 39 articles to move them in a much more self-consciously reformed direction, and to perhaps bring changes to the church and the dissolution of the bishopric. However, this changes quite rapidly with the what is known as the Solemn League and Covenant, in which the English parliamentary forces ally with the Scottish nation to fight against the king. In this, the Scottish representatives demand a unity of church between the two nations. So, under James I and IV of Scotland, the two crowns had been united in one monarch. And with the Solemn League and Covenant, there's a desire to unite the two churches under a Presbyterian form of government. So, the assembly actually, which is made up entirely of English divines, but with a few councillors from Scotland, 7 in number, including Samuel Rutherford and others, will set to completely reform the English church in line with the Reformed and Presbyterian understanding of Christianity. There's much more that could be said there, and there's actually an entire course at Covenant on the Westminster Assembly. But out of this come several documents that will be quite important in the later history of the church, and especially those strands that are reformed, such as the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is the confession of faith of most Presbyterian denominations around the world, along with its two catechisms, the longer and shorter, and a directory of worship that in its design was to overtake the Book of Common Prayer. The assembly did this work over a rather short period of time, only 5 years, but it was not isolated to England. They would carry on correspondence with the continental Reformed traditions as well, and were very well informed. The work of this council, or this assembly, would be quite significant for later developments in theology. Moving past the Civil War, we enter the era known as the Commonwealth, or the Interregnum, which is seen by many as a rather chaotic time. In this, Oliver Cromwell, who had been the leader of what was known as the New Model Army, the parliamentary army that had been organized under rational lines that had been extremely effective against royalist forces. Cromwell had originally been a member of Parliament, but rose up to be the leader of the army. And he was, in some ways, one of the great military geniuses of world history. After the Civil War and the execution of Charles IV, Cromwell is raised up to the position of Lord Protector, and he will hold this position for 5 years. His son, Richard Cromwell, will follow him for 2 years. But after this, there is a growing dissatisfaction with the Commonwealth and this period of interregnum. That just means between the kings. And Charles I's son, Charles II, is invited back to take the throne in 1660 in what is called the Restoration. Under the time of the Commonwealth, the Protectorate saw the failure of the Westminster documents to take hold in England, because the winds had shifted much further away, even from Presbyterianism, to ideas of independency, that is, more of a congregational structure. This idea had spread quite rapidly within the army, and this had destabilized the hopes for a unified church with Scotland, and led to general chaos in the English church during this period, including the rising up of more radical sects, such as the Quakers, who rejected all the sacraments and clergy entirely, etc., even to figures such as the Diggers and the Levelers, who were advocating early forms of communal marriage and even communism. And these things kind of got out of control. And many of the other powers around Europe saw this as what happens when you overthrow a king. So the natural order of things was seen to be overthrown, and therefore, of course, the country is going to devolve into religious chaos. So the protectorate or the Commonwealth does not last very long. And this will be a return to the religious policies, more or less, under Elizabeth I, under the reign of Charles II. There's much more that goes on in English church history after this, but we're going to stop here and look briefly at the nature of the Westminster Confession for a second. So, although the Westminster Assembly actually failed to effect any religious change in England during the 17th century, none of the works of the Assembly were adopted by the English Church. There was never a functioning Presbyterian government. There was never really the adoption of the Confession or the Catechisms or the form of worships. The Assembly would define the Presbyterian tradition through what happened in Scotland, which does actually adopt the Confession that was written in England, and this will then be translated into the American Church. However, the Westminster Confession will not be only that of Presbyterians. It will also be taken up by the Baptists in what is called the London Confession of 1689, which is more or less a modified version of the Westminster Confession of Faith, excising the position on certain parts of the nature of the church and the practice of infant baptism. It will also be accepted by Congregationalist churches in the New World in what is called the Savoy Declaration, which is a slightly modified version of the Westminster Confession. And this confession can be found as the doctrinal standard to this day in countless Presbyterian and Reformed denominations around the world. So in some ways, it is a successful failure. A failure in that it never accomplished what it was meant to do originally, which was to bring forth a religious unity in the English Church and to implement a kind of completion of the Reformation along the lines that the Puritans desired. In that, it completely failed. But its influence spread much further than England, especially through Scotland and the spreading of the Reformed tradition throughout the world. All right, having set forth the English Reformation and its consequences up to the mid-16th century, I want us now to turn our eyes to the Catholic Reformation and how did the Catholic Church respond to these reform movements. And we'll look at two elements. How did they address the abuses that the reformers pointed out within the church, and how did they respond to the Protestant reformers themselves? Luther and Zwingli were not the only forces calling for a reform of the church at the beginning of the 16th century. But there were many movements of reform internal to the Catholic Church, one of them being the humanist movement that we discussed last time. That was an intentional attempt to move back to the original sources of the Bible and to reform theology and encourage right practice among the clergy and devotional piety among the laity. One of these important early Catholic reformers was Erasmus, who was a leading humanist in Switzerland, especially based in Basel. Some claim that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched because Erasmus had already been critiquing the abuses of the church and had been calling for reform. However, Erasmus would remain committed to the Catholic Church throughout his life and would pursue an agenda of reforming from within, refusing to break ties with the Roman Catholic Church. In this, he did engage with debates over this with the Protestants, especially a famous debate with Luther over the freedom of the will, with Luther arguing for a bonded will that is unable to turn to God except for his grace imparting faith itself, while Erasmus will hold to a much stronger position on free will, that is what we've discussed before as a semi-Augustinian position. Erasmus is not alone as early Catholic reformers, but many bishops who still rejected Protestantism, but saw the validity of the critique of the uneducated nature of the clergy, the immorality of the clergy, the financial corruption of the church, and sought to reform it. There were brief moments where there almost seemed to be a unified agreement between the Catholics and the Protestants on this, specifically at the Regensburg Colloquy, in which it seemed to be some agreement on even the doctrine of justification. However, this was largely based on careful double readings of texts and never gained larger accord throughout the Reformed and the Catholic world. Therefore, I'm going to focus on two things as we look at the Catholic Church's response. How did they attempt to reform the church from within, and how did they attempt to combat Protestantism from without. These two elements can often be distinguished as the Catholic Reformation, that being how the Church sought to reform itself from within, and the Counter-Reformation, which are those movements outward to oppose Protestantism. We'll also take a look at some of the early missionary work of the Catholic monastic orders, the Catholic mendicant orders, such as the Jesuits, and how they worked to spread the Catholic faith throughout the world. Let's begin with a reform within the Church with the calling of the Council of Trent. This council met over 3 sessions, variously placed between 1545 and 1563. And its official attempt was to discuss the reform of the Church and to clearly define Catholic dogma or official teaching. So there were many areas that were reformed in response to Protestant critiques. For instance, there was a call for the better education and piety of the priest, which was given, the bishops were given the responsibility to establish seminaries throughout their diocese and to ensure that the moral life of the priests was up to standards. There was also an improvement of discipline, and so what does one do for priests who fail to fulfill their vows? Especially one of the practices in the Middle Ages that caused such problems was called holding multiple pulpits at once. Maybe a priest would be assigned to 6 different rural pulpits and he would never show up to any of them. And so having much more improved discipline, making sure the priests did their jobs, and that there was greater administration and accountability amongst the clergy. This has the effect of more centralizing the structure of the Catholic Church. Before the Reformation in the Middle Ages, there is a much more kind of organic and free-form administration through most of the Church. With the Council of Trent, the kind of hierarchical structure of Pope, archbishops, bishops, priests in diaconal form, each broken up to a small area of organization, was much more solidified. So these reforms do take place. There is an emphasis on better education for the clergy and an emphasis on proper piety. However, there are many teachings that are not changed and in fact are reinforced, especially those ideas that were rejected by the Protestant movement. There is a clear reaffirmation of the need of both faith and good works to achieve salvation, coming down very hard on a semi-Augustinian, if not semi-Pelagian position. There's a reaffirmation of the seven sacraments against the Protestants' claim of 2, and an official adoption of the doctrine of transubstantiation as the only possible position to be held within the Catholic Church. There's a doubling down on that the Bible ought to be read in Latin, specifically the Vulgate translation from Jerome, and not in its original languages as the Protestants put forward. And neither was it to be read in local translation. The worry here is that laity should not be interpreting the Bible on their own, but should rely on the teaching authority of the Church to interpret the Bible. This is also where the Catholic Church officially affirms what we know as the Apocrypha, the additional books at the end of the Old Testament that the Protestants rejected because they were not present in the earliest Jewish canons. The Council also clearly reaffirms the supremacy of the Pope as the leader of the Church. This is officially the death of the movement of conciliarism we mentioned last time, the idea that church councils could rank above the Pope and make decrees throughout the Church. And so because the Pope is overseeing the Council of Trent and must approve all of its declarations, he is very clearly set up above all councils, and it will remain this way till the end. There's also a clear affirmation following after Erasmus' position of humanity's free will and a rejection of the Lutheran and Calvinist doctrine of predestination, moving much more once again into something like a semi-Augustinian or even semi-Pelagian doctrine. One of the clearest differences I think we can illustrate by looking at Trent's decree on justification and comparing that to that of Luther. So we recall that Luther held that one is justified by grace through faith. This was all that was necessary to be declared righteous before God. This is how the Council of Trent defines justification. Having therefore been thus justified and made the friends and domestics of God, advancing from virtue to virtue, they are renewed, as the Apostle says, day by day. That is, by mortifying the members of their own flesh, and by presenting them as instruments of justice unto sanctification. They, through the observance of the commandments of God and of the church, faith cooperating with good works, increase in that justice which they have received through the grace of Christ, and are still further justified. So in this idea, we see an alternative formula, justification by faith as it cooperates with good works. And notice justification here is being used in a different way than it is in the Lutheran tradition, as well as the Reformed. In these traditions, justification is a state that one enters into. One is declared righteous before God. It is not a process. It is an act of God declaring the righteousness of the person. In the Tridentine understanding of justification, it is in fact a process. Human acts can, after the act of God's grace, choose to have faith, and then through the cooperation with good works, which is also engraced by the Spirit, one can grow in justification. So in this Tridentine understanding of justification, one is not actually justified until the end of their life. And there's still room for the acts of purgatory and masses for the dead, etc. In this formulation, the Council of Trent definitively rejects the Protestant position of justification by faith alone, and it is anathematized in the council itself. The council says, "If anyone saith that by faith alone the impious is justified in such wise as to mean that nothing else is required to cooperate in order to the attaining of the grace of justification, and that it is not in any way necessary that he be prepared and disposed by the movement of his own will, let him be anathema." So in this, there is a rejection of the Protestant position in its entirety, which rejects a cooperation of the human will in the act of faith or in the act of justification itself. This should be very clearly seen that in the Protestant tradition there is a distinction between justification, being declared righteous before God, and sanctification, which is a following process by which God remakes us into his own image through holiness. But this is not in order to gain salvation, but because salvation has already been gained. And this can be illustrated by seeing the relationship of good works in both the Luther's formulation and that of Trent. Luther's formulation is followed by the Reform as well, so there's no need to distinguish them here. For Luther, grace comes first, and grace gives human beings faith so that we can trust in God. Because of that faith that God has given as a gift, we are then justified. Being united to Christ in his death, we receive his righteousness alone, and it is purely on that basis that one is declared right before God. Entering into this new state in relationship to God, becoming his son or daughter, becoming both the servant of God and the friend of Christ, we can now enter into a new way of life, which we would call sanctification, this progressive process of being made holy. We've been declared righteous. God has seen us through the lens of Christ, and therefore we can live out of that, out of gratitude, and do good works. So good works in the Lutheran and Reformed tradition flow out of the status of being justified and knowing that we are right with God by the power of the Spirit. In the Tridentine formula, grace does precede the opportunity for faith. So it is semi-Augustinian or maybe semi-Pelagian, depending on how this opportunity for faith is understood. Generally, it's understood in a more semi-Augustinian way, in which grace restores humans' will enough that they might know and choose God. And then, with this operation of faith, plus a cooperation of the human will, one is eventually justified. And it's that human cooperation where we see the good works functioning. So grace enables an opportunity for faith, enables an act of cooperating in good works with the grace of God, and the end result is justification at the end of life or after purgatory. So we see here that even though they might be closer than you have thought, which is some people consider the Roman Catholic Church giving a purely works-based view of salvation, which it does not do. Grace does precede all this in the Roman Catholic understanding. However, it is a very different position, especially with reference to good works, than we see in the Reformation. And this difference, while it maybe has been softened in some ways to the present day, remains fairly clearly intact between the two traditions. So this was the reform within the church, fixing some of the errors and reaffirming the doctrines that had been challenged by Protestantism. This leads us to a period in the Catholic Church's history that's generally called Tridentine Catholicism. Tridentine just being the adjective for Trent. And this period of Catholic history will last from the beginning of the Council in the 1540s all the way up to the 1960s with the calling of the Second Vatican Council that we'll talk about later in the class. There's some features I want to point out of this period within Roman Catholic history. In some ways, this represents a narrowing of the possibilities of Catholic orthodoxy in response to Protestantism. In the medieval church, there were many positions that there was allowed to be latitude on them. For instance, transubstantiation, while being the official doctrine of the church in the Middle Ages, could be held in various ways and was not the only way to articulate the nature of Christ's presence in the Lord's Supper in the Middle Ages. We see even some of the doctors of the church, such as St. Bonaventure in the 13th century, rejecting transubstantiation quite clearly. However, with the kind of tightening up of clear orthodoxy after Trent, many of those diverse positions are squeezed out and only one position is now allowed. Similar on questions of justification and even predestination. In the Middle Ages, you see formulations that are very close to that of Luther and Calvin, both on justification and on predestination. However, with the narrowing of focus in the Council of Trent, these positions are no longer allowed. This can be seen by later movements in the Catholic Church, such as the Jansenists, who come to what would be seen as a full Augustinian position on salvation, and are actually condemned as heretics because they're too close to Calvinist doctrine. Also, Tridentine Catholicism is the definitive elevation of the authority of the Pope. The winds of conciliar authority that we see moving at the end of the Middle Ages are definitively removed. And we see this much clearer hierarchy from Pope, Archbishop, Bishop to local diocesan priest affirmed much more clearly. In some ways, the centrality of authority in the Catholic Church is re-emphasized at Trent in a way greater than it was possible before the time of the Reformation. This is partially a defensive move to shore up the needs of the Catholic position, but also this was an attempt to actually address some of the abuses of the clergy, especially their lapses in moral standards and lack of education. This had an effect of increasing the power of the hierarchical church, which continues more or less to this day. It also upheld the use of Latin as the language of the church. The Bible was only to be read in Latin, which took it out of the hands of most of the laity. And the Mass was still to be held in the Latin tongue, with the priest facing away from the congregation. In this way, there was always a certain alienation of lay spirituality from the spirituality of the church, which led to some of these movements of internal reform of new orders that focused on personal piety. But this emphasis on Latin within the Catholic Church would also continue into the 1960s. It wasn't until 1963 that the Mass ceased to be held in Latin throughout the entire world, and there was more openness in 19th and 20th century to vernacular versions of the Bible. But the Tridentine model of the kind of removal of the Bible from the laity and the emphasis on the interpretive authority of the church magisterium would be a defining feature of the Catholic tradition for the next 400 years after Trent. Moving forward to some other reforms within the church, Trent did help revitalize the Catholic Church, as did the creation of new Catholic religious orders. And these focus very much on performing charity and good works. There were a number of smaller orders founded, specifically caring for the poor, going out to strengthen the preaching in rural parishes, encouraging piety and simple living. This was added to it with lay religious associations that developed much more personal views of piety, often reflecting upon, there's a re-emphasis on the veneration of saints. The commitment to the veneration of Mary increases in this period, and we also have different kind of spiritual renewal movements outside of the standard Catholic Church that are being encouraged. One of these new religious orders that needs to be taken into account is that of the Jesuits, founded by Ignatius of Loyola in 1540, is when it's initially approved by the papacy. Loyola is a very interesting figure. He was a Spanish nobleman who was injured in a battle in the early 16th century at the Battle of Paloma. As he's recuperating from, I believe he took a cannonball in the knee, he's given many spiritual classics, and he has a conversion experience, and he wants to dedicate himself to God. He therefore goes to the University of Paris, where he is trained in theology, and he and several of his classmates decide they want to follow an order that is committed to the way of Jesus. And in this, they form a society known as the Society of Jesus, which is approved as this new religious order. One of the keystones of Ignatius's project is his work called the Spiritual Exercises, which is an imaginative attempt to wrestle with our sin, to reflect on different passages from the Bible and stories, to reflect on our sin, the act of Christ, and the need of moving forward in holiness. It's very much a more experiential piety, and it's still very popular in anything that is called Ignatian spirituality. The Jesuits' mission was very firmly to reform the church and to push back against Protestantism. They did this partially through promoting education. Recall, Trent demanded that the clergy be educated on the local level. The Jesuits were ones who filled this role very clearly. They also were very adamant to engage in missionary work and to spread the gospel beyond Europe, especially allying themselves with the Spanish and Portuguese trading ships going to the east. We'll talk about that in a moment. They attempted also to counter the populist appeal of the Protestant Reformation by working top down. So they would become the councils to kings and princes, and would try to bring these upper crust people back into the Catholic fold, and therefore bring about the return of Catholicism in these various areas, or at least keep the Protestant tradition away. And in addition to their vow of poverty and celibacy, as many other traditions, the Society of Jesus takes a special vow of loyalty to the Pope himself. One of the famous quotes from the Spiritual Exercises about this commitment to the authority of the church is that even if the Pope were to say, "What is white is black, or black is white," one should obey because of the authority of the papacy. That's a paraphrase. But this order would be very influential throughout the 16th through the 18th century. It would fall in some hard times later on, but it's still a fairly important aspect of Catholic thought today. Many of the Catholic schools you would think of in the United States are in fact Jesuits, such as Marquette, St. Louis University, Georgetown, etc. The mission of the Jesuits in resisting Protestantism can be seen in two ways. They would actively debate Protestant reformers. The initial stage of the Protestant Reformation was often marked with public debate. We see this with Luther at Heidelberg. Zwingli wins over parts of Zurich through a disputation in 1521, for instance. And in the initial debates, many of the Protestants get the better of their Catholic opponents. The Jesuits, being very well trained in philosophy, rhetoric, and theology, would begin to debate Protestants and in some ways would have more success. They would also found various religious universities to educate the elites of the society into a Catholic tradition. It is in fact through this means that much of the church in Poland and Lithuania would be moved back into the Catholic fold. If you recall our maps earlier, Lithuania, which at the time was a much larger country, and Poland were actually this swirl of different Lutheran, Reformed, Anabaptist, and Catholic forces. It's almost single-handedly through the Jesuit order that it is brought much clearly and definitively into the Catholic camp at this time. And this is partially through educating the children of the elites. After several generations of elite Protestant children going to Catholic universities and the attrition of them engaging with very intelligent Catholic interlocutors does remove the Protestant nobility from Poland in several generations. This engagement with Protestantism was not only on the level of public debate, but also written disputations. Some of the most powerful critiques of the Reformed and Protestant tradition generally come from the pen of Jesuits. One of the most significant that we can use as an example is Robert Bellarmine. Bellarmine served as a papal theologian in Rome, and he was a specialist in polemics against Protestantism, and he carried this over a very long career. His famous work is De Controversii, which was written at least in 3 volumes, sometimes published in 4, from 1586 to 1593, which presented a very thorough apology for Catholic dogma against the Protestant churches. And this movement by Jesuits and other religious orders such as the Dominicans and the Franciscans had a very important influence on Protestant theology, in that they realized they had to produce works of the same scholastic rigor and clear theological and philosophical reasoning if they were going to continue to defend the faith against these positions. Richard Muller has described this. He was referencing here a very specific response, but I think it works for the entirety of this period, as the Reformed tradition and the Lutheran tradition have to turn to a very careful reasoned theology to address the sort of attacks coming from Jesuits like Bellarmine. This is what Muller says. The scholastic detail and mastery of sources typical of Bellarmine's work pressed Protestants to deal with writings of the Fathers, the Scholastics, the Church Councils, and Aristotle. I think this well sums up someone like Bellarmine. He is giving very powerful arguments that are weaving together philosophical reasoning, the work of the Church Fathers, and philosophical reasoning to attack Protestantism. Responding to Bellarmine in some ways was a cottage industry afterwards, with many of the great Protestant theologians of the age writing multi-volume refutations of Bellarmine's thought, including English theologians such as William Ames, and such famous figures as Bishop Ulster and others would have to write multi-volume refutations of Bellarmine's works. There would actually be entire courses at Protestant universities that would systematically go through and dispute the claims of figures like Bellarmine. And this would force the Protestant theology to develop its own rigor and a scholastic flavor to address such attacks. That would not come only from Bellarmine, but from many Jesuit theologians, especially those based in Spain. So this is the Jesuit activity within the church, trying to push back against Protestantism, but they also would be extremely influential as missionaries. So we should never think that there's any time in the church where missionary activity ceased, but there are times where it moved forward much more rapidly. Throughout the Middle Ages, there were missionary attempts to Eastern Europe, to Russia, and to the Scandinavian countries that progressively converted all of European society to the Christian tradition. But there had been little missionary activity to the east or to the south because of the influence of Islam. There were occasional attempts of people learning Arabic and trying to preach to the Muslim world. This did not seem to bear much fruit. Francis of Assisi, for instance, went to Egypt to preach before the Caliph. But it's really in this period that world missions kick off again. And this is partially done by the spread of the Spanish and the Portuguese Empire. In the in the 15th century, there's a development within sailing technology that allows especially the Portuguese to round the tip of Africa and establish a sea route to India and the Far East. This becomes extremely lucrative in the trading of spices and other goods, especially silk. And following these trade routes are those committed to spreading the gospel of Christ. The Jesuits are very quick to jump on this. Some of their most famous missionaries are people like Francis Xavier, who preached the gospel in India, in the Philippines, and Japan, and died on his way to China, and Matteo Ricci, who was one of the first missionaries to bring the gospel back to China after its destruction and the Tang dynasty that we discussed earlier. I do want to discuss a little more in depth one of the great successes of this movement, which was the Christianization of Japan, or what is sometimes called Japan's Christian century. Francis Xavier arrives in Japan in 1549, and he's able to quite quickly gain hearings of the gospel in the Japanese nobility. Xavier had a quite malleable understanding of missionary practice. When he preached the gospel in India in the Portuguese port of Goa, he actually adopted the posture and the clothing of the lowest classes because they were receptive to the gospel. And these are known as the Dalits, those who are below the caste system in India. And so he would dress extremely simply and preach the gospel to them. It was especially concerned with the pearl farmers on the coast, and there were many converts and many baptisms. When he arrives in Japan, he realized that this is not a strategy that will work here. And so he adopts much more of a strategy towards the elite of society. This strategy is further put forward by one of his successors of the Jesuit order within Japan, of Alessandro Vigliano, who adopts the posture of upper class nobility and especially that of Buddhist monks, so that the Japanese could see the Jesuits as what they would expect of a religious leader, to be respected. So there was an intentional paying of honor within the society to attempt to gain a hearing. When the Jesuits arrived in Japan, it was in a time of political disunity with a weak emperor and many powerful local lords. By roughly 1614, though, there would be roughly 300,000 Christians in Japan. This was generally the conversion of their feudal lord that would then encourage the people under them to convert as well. We see this pattern also in the conversion of many peoples in Europe. So they focus mainly on these feudal lords, the daimyo, and this is going quite well until the arrival of the Franciscans in 1593. So there was generally squabbling between the religious orders of who has kind of the territory to do missions work there, because they have different emphases, different focuses, and there's always turf wars within any organization, the church not excluded. But what makes the Franciscans rather volatile to this situation is what had happened in the Philippines just the many decades before. So the Spanish had initiated contact with the Philippines, and through a period of time and the conversion and work of the Franciscans and some weak political elements there, the Spanish were able to colonize the Philippines. And many others within the surrounding cultures saw the Franciscans as what is known as a fifth column, that the conversion of their people to Catholicism was just a way to set up the incorporation of their society under the boot of European colonialism. So the Franciscans come and begin preaching throughout Japan, and many of the Japanese leaders begin to worry about the Christian minority within the country. Is this just setting up for us to be taken over by European powers? This is further exacerbated by what is known as the San Felipe incident in 1596, in which a Spanish ship wrecks on the Japanese coast. And this causes an international incident because the owner of the ship basically invokes the fact that the powers of Europe will come and take over Japan if they do not give him this right. It's kind of this is then supported by certain Franciscan forces in the country. This confirms the fear of many of the upper crust Japanese that this whole Christian thing is just a way to bring their country down and bring them under the control of one of the European powers, probably Spain, which had, as I said, happened in the Philippines only decades before. Therefore, with the rise of a new powerful unifying force known as the Tokugawa shogunate in 1600, the fate of Christianity is quite drastically shifted. In 1614, Tokugawa, who is now the shogun of all Japan, the emperor still is reigning but more as a puppet figure at this point, Tokugawa issues a ban on Christianity. All churches were closed, all missionaries were expelled, and all believers were required to recant upon pain of death. It is estimated that 13% of believers were martyred in this, and they were martyred by crucifixion as a way to, in some ways, insult them by doing to them what was done to Christ. It's actually these incidents that are set forth in the Endo work, Silence, which was recently made into a film. The persecution of the church in Japan was extremely successful from the perspective of the Tokugawa regime, with in 1638 only 5 surviving priests in the entire country. This will be followed by the closing of Japan to all foreigners until the 19th century, where in what's known as gunboat diplomacy, it is opened back up to trade with the West through British and American force, more or less. So we see this as one of the great examples of failure in the missionary endeavor. There was great blossoming of faith, but unfortunately the political elements of Christians' relationship with colonialism caused great pain and suffering and a setback for the kingdom of God in this. Now, not all Japanese Christians apostatized, but when Japan was reopened in the 19th century, they did find communities of Christians known as the hidden church who remained throughout the centuries of the illegal nature of Christianity. So the church did remain, even in a tiny form in very isolated places. But it was quite a drastic failure of Christianity to spread in Japan. The Jesuits also produced missionary success in China, which varied based on the political climate of the Chinese Empire at the time, and were very influential in their work in South and Central America as well, spreading the gospel and teaching at their various institutions and universities. So this is just to give somewhat of an example of the various changes that were taking place in Catholicism after the rise of Protestantism. We see a reform within the church through the Council of Trent, trying to increase the education and piety of the clergy. We also see reform through the founding of new religious movements that would revitalize Catholic missions and Catholic piety, and a very concerted attempt to combat Protestantism without. We didn't get into all that, but there was a very intentional moves to combat them on the level of education and political writing as well. Before I end, I want to reflect briefly on the results of the Reformation era. If you recall, we looked at the map of England, or the map of Europe in 1400, which is a unified religious political unit. By the end of the Reformation, we see a division of various sects, from the Reformed to the Lutheran to the Catholic, and in some ways the Anglican moves out here. The Reformation results in a much more disunified church, but it does solidify in many ways the importance of theology for the truth of Christianity. Christianity is not just about practice, and it is not just about unity, but the truth and peace of the church are important as well. And what happened is many of the struggles that have existed in the church throughout the Middle Ages ultimately separated the church and were not able to be reconciled. The diversity of opinions that was able to coincide in some ways in the Middle Ages broke down, especially over the question of papal authority and questions of the doctrine of justification. So we can celebrate in the Reformation, I think, because it is true that the biblical doctrines of salvation by faith alone, the introduction of sola scriptura, and the wiping away of impure doctrines as they came about in the Middle Ages was achieved by the Protestant reformers. But we can also mourn the disunity that has resulted, and there were many consequences of the Reformation that were never intended. This did lead to long periods of warfare and political strife. This did lead to, in some ways, the elevation of the individual over the corporate, which will have some effects later as we look at the Enlightenment. And this had this growing division between Catholic and Protestant countries that more or less remains to this day. So I think we can look back at the Reformation with a lot of appreciation for the things that were done by these reformers, this proclaiming of the biblical truth that we too should hold firm to. But we can also mourn the unfortunate results of many of these struggles at the same time. All right. Next time, we're going to be shifting our focus yet again and zooming in on the history of the church in America, looking at the American colonies and the First Great Awakening. These are events that, while they take place in America, will have broader implications for the church throughout the world. So I look forward to talking with you then.